Okay, today we're going to talk about a book. Let's see here. Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee. This book was written in 1980. And it's a short little thing, just 150 pages. And yeah, it's rich in themes, discussions of colonialism and imperialism. And it's a very affecting work, so we're going to talk about it. The book opens, page 1. I have never seen anything like it. 2 little discs of glass suspended in front of his eyes in loops of wire. Is he blind? I could understand it if he wanted to hide blind eyes, but he is not blind. The discs are dark. They look opaque from the outside, but he can see through them. He tells me they are a new invention. Okay? So that is the opening scene, the opening observation of our unnamed protagonist, unnamed magistrate in a settlement. He operates governing a settlement of the empire, and he gets visited by Colonel Jol. And Colonel Jol is a military man from the empire, and he comes to round up barbarians. Barbarians, of course, are the natives, are the indigenous people on this land. And he's beginning this project of trying to protect the empire against these dangerous barbarians. And of course, our unnamed narrator is amazed at Colonel Jol's sunglasses. Our protagonist is horrified by Colonel Jol's brutality. He's a bit of a sadist, and he rounds up a bunch of these indigenous peoples, and he starts to interrogate them. Our narrator has no reason to be alarmed or concerned. He's had only peaceful interactions so far with these quote barbarians, but Colonel Jol feels otherwise. In the beginning of the book, our narrator sort of learns about what Colonel Jol is doing. He says, before I go to bed, I take a lantern, cross the square, and circle through the back streets to the granary. There is a new guard at the door of the hut. Another peasant boy wrapped in his blanket, asleep. The cricket stops its singing at my approach. The pulling of the bolt does not waken the guard. I enter the hut, holding the lantern high, trespassing, I realize, on what has become holy or unholy ground, if there is any difference. Preserve of the mysteries of the state. He walks in on what's basically become a torture chamber, and he gets all of a sudden this confrontation with this war on terror, with this war on the hostile native population. Skipping ahead, and this is sort of his understanding of what's going on right now in the empire. Last year, stories began to reach us from the capital of unrest among the barbarians. Traders traveling safe routes had been attacked and plundered. There's terror attacks. Stock thefts had increased in scale and audacity. A party of census officials had disappeared and been found buried in shallow graves. Shots had been fired at a provincial governor during a tour of inspection. There had been clashes with border patrols. The barbarian tribes were arming, the rumor went. The empire should take precautionary measures, for there would certainly be war. And what this book is about, ultimately, is the power of a war footing, the power of, war on terror, the power of the fear, no man, there's no woman living along the frontier who has not dreamed of a dark barbarian hand coming from under the bed to grip her ankle. No man who has not frightened himself with visions of barbarians carousing in his home, breaking the plates, setting fire to the curtains, raping his daughters. And then our narrator says his perspective, which is that these dreams are the consequence of too much ease. Right? Show me a barbarian army and I will believe. And that's the juxtaposition. That's the tension that animates this book and animates much of politics when it comes to security and national security and the war on terror. On the one hand is fear. On the one hand is real fear. On the one hand are attacks, are terror attacks, are real examples of violence. And that's used to justify a war on terror. That's used to justify a war against the outsider. for very, very understandable reasons, you know. But our narrator is a little more skeptical. He doesn't buy into that hype. He's not as afraid. You know, he says these dreams are the consequence of too much ease. You know, he says when you're living comfortably in your homes, you know, on the empire, in the empire, on the frontier, surrounded by people who are outsiders, different than you. Yeah, there's going to be these anxieties, you know, and that's the tension. One of the things that I think is so powerful about the book is the way in which our unnamed narrator sort of falls into his position of being, you might say, anti-colonial, to use our modern terminology. He doesn't buy in to this fear mongering. He doesn't buy into this war on terror, and it's not because of any moral superiority. You know, there's nothing in the book that indicates our narrator is a particularly philosophically minded, morally concerned person. You know, he engages in the kind of behaviors that his everyone in his society engages in. He basically takes a barbarian woman as a mistress and rapes her. He's just not. That's to say he's not morally evolved in some sense. He's no Dalai Lama, but he just lacks a certain level of fear, a certain level of anxiety, and that's it. And that's all that happens, you know. And he's going to observe. He's going to see what happens as the empire takes on this war footing, as the empire goes to war and tries to protect itself against this dangerous outsider. And what we see immediately in the book from the very beginning and as a thread throughout the book is torture. The weapon, the power of torture. Horrible things are described. Horrible things are done to these captured barbarians, trying to extract from them knowledge. Tell us, are you arming? Are you not arming? And Colonel Joel himself, who we met in the first page of the book, is quite a sadistic torturer himself. Yeah, I mean, in the real world, yeah, torture comes up a lot. This sort of pattern that's described in the book is, you can find examples of it in many places. This is an example of this quote here about, no woman living along the frontier has not dreamed of a dark barbarian hand coming from under the bed to grip her ankle. Reminds me of, some stuff I read from Dr. Gerald Horne, talking about the counter-revolution of 1776, talking about the history of slavery in America. And one of the things I learned in reading that book, which I hadn't previously thought about, was how so much of slavery and the brutality of slavery was motivated by this fear of the slave. How every slave owner dreamed of the slaves uprising and the slaves coming in the middle of the night and raping their women, And so much of the brutality of slavery as we know it is meaning the brutality of the slave owners towards the slaves, is the flip side of that fear. And it's not just that, America's war on terror. We're going to talk more about that. You can read America's mass incarceration through this lens. It's a lens, which is a very powerful lens that I think this book explores, and we're going to continue to explore. And it could be applied, I think, to a lot of different elements, a lot of different events in history. Again, we have a collection of these barbarians who are captives, and they're living in this granary. And they're sort of around the town, they're around the settlement. And our narrator describes that for a few days, the fisher folk, these prisoners, are a diversion with their strange gabbling, their vast appetites, their animal shamelessness, their volatile tempers. The soldiers lounge in doorways watching them, making obscene comments about them which they do not understand, laughing. There are always children with their faces pressed to the bars of the gate. And from my window I stare down, invisible behind the glass. Okay, and then something happens, right? And this is a key move. This is a key interrogation of human nature and human psychology, right? Then, altogether, we lose sympathy with them. The filth, the smell, the noise of their quarreling, the coughing becomes too much. There's an ugly incident when a soldier tries to drag one of their women indoors, perhaps only in play, who knows, and is pelted with stones. A rumor begins to go the rounds that they are diseased, that they will bring an epidemic to the town. And this continues. And this transition, I think, is such a crucial element of human psychology. The way in which oppression and the symptoms of oppression lead to more oppression. When people are living in conditions that are dehumanizing, it is easy to dehumanize them in a vicious cycle. And the consequence of this is that, again, torture, cruelty is sort of something baked into human society here, to our capabilities as human beings. It's almost a default, the resistance to cruelty, resistance to this kind of torture and dehumanization is almost the exception to the rule. Abu Ghraib, one of the places where I first started thinking more and reading more about Abu Ghraib is from this wonderful book, The Art of Cruelty by Maggie Nelson. A really wonderful book of nonfiction stuff related to aesthetics and art and cruelty and politics and Nietzsche and all these great themes. And she's a very incisive thinker, in my opinion. And she talks in the book about the example of al-Jamadi in Abu Ghraib, who died after being subjected to torture. She says here, a form of torture known as a Palestinian hanging. It's one of the many enhanced interrogation techniques approved by the Bush administration. One has one's arms shackled behind one's back, then affixed far above the torso. You can find pictures of all this on Wikipedia, of course, and much, much worse. When finally CIA interrogators removed his hood and lowered his body to the ground, blood came gushing out of his nose and mouth as if a faucet had been turned on. This kind of gruesome, brutal description is actually the kind of thing you'll find in Waiting for the Barbarians to some extent. Not a Palestinian hanging per se, but that's the kind of cruelty and sadism that characterizes this project of interrogating the barbarians in the book. And it's universal in a sense, right? I mean, it was characterized America's war on terror. And if you read The Origins of Totalitarianism, and if you read, she cites Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness as an example of European imperialism in Africa, also equally brutal, equally torturous, equally barbarous. She talks about the cover-up, and the pictures that the guards, the American soldiers took at Abu Ghraib with the dead body, which is like a bludgeoned, horrific thing. And women took pictures, meaning women guards, American women soldiers were part of this torture. So, she explores sort of what that meant, philosophically, to sort of see that. So, for many, for whom a female reclamation of sadism provides no reason to rejoice, the photographs from Abu Ghraib depicting Specialist Megan Ombul, Private First Class Lindy England, and Specialist Sabrina Herman engaged in brutal acts of torture and sexual abuse were devastating. Writer Barbara Ehrenreich went so far as to claim that a certain kind of feminism, or perhaps I should say a certain kind of feminist naivety, died in Abu Ghraib. The feminist naivety she's referring to is the kind that saw men as perpetual perpetrators, women as the perpetual victims, and male sexual violence as the root of all injustice, and presumed that women were morally superior to men due to their lesser inclination towards cruelty and violence. All that was before, Ehrenreich says, we had seen female sexual sadism in action. I'm reminded of a line from Hanoch Levine in his amazing play Murder. The name of the play is Murder, Retzach. And in that play, the show opens with soldiers and a dead body. And the soldiers had killed this suspected terrorist. And the father shows up. And the father is horrified. He can't bear to see his dead body. And he sees that the body was abused. The body was the soldiers tortured the boy, and just the whole play is, I love, amazing. But one line that just always haunts me is the father says to the soldiers, you took out his eye. He says, how could you take out a boy's eye? He says, if there's a scratch on your eye, if you have something in your eye, you can't do anything. it's agony. It's so painful. A single scratch on an eye, but you took out the boy's eye. You know, how could you do that? And the implied answer is that we can do that. Human beings can do that. We are totally capable of doing that. And the mechanisms are related to fear. They're related to war and terror. They're related to ideas about the greater good. They're related to ideas of security and protecting ourselves. And we can totally do that. And they're also related to the sense of as people are dehumanized, as people's living conditions are worse and worse, it becomes easier and easier to dehumanize, and easier to think of them less and less as being worthy of moral consideration. And the following pages is one of the more most powerful quotes in the book for me, and it's there's a lot of beautiful quotes that I think really cut to the moral core of the book. And so our protagonist is really in an awful spot. He knows what's happening. He sees this unjust cruelty, this wanton cruelty being perpetrated against the barbarians that he has no problem with. And he can't do anything about it. His hands are tied. He can't tell Colonel Joel or anyone from the Empire that he resists, or what's he going to do? Eventually, our protagonist narrator will end up in prison for his small amount of resistance, but he's nothing he can do, and it leads him to feel extremely depressed. And this book is largely about the effect of that knowledge. There's nothing he can do, but his empire is perpetrating cruelty, and he can't do anything about it. It's being perpetrated in the name of a war on terror. And he reflects on this experience. He interrogates this experience. He says, "It is the knowledge of how contingent my unease is, how dependent on a baby that wails beneath my window one day and does not wail the next, that brings the worst shame to me, the greatest indifference to annihilation." Right? It just, he can, as long as he can tune it out, as long as he doesn't know, he's fine. But when he hears the baby wailing underneath his window, then he's affected. And this is a source of shame. I know somewhat too much, right? I love this. It's sort of like this curse of knowledge. It's not morality. It's not, reasoning, philosophy. It's just a piece of knowledge that he has. And from this knowledge, once one has been infected, there seems to be no recovering. I ought never to have taken my lantern to see what was going on in the hut by the granary. Right? If only I just didn't know. It would be so much easier. If only I didn't know. On the other hand, there was no way, once I had picked up the lantern, for me to put it down again. The knot loops in upon itself. I cannot find the end. This very powerful poetic language of just being trapped, stuck in this state of knowledge that he can't escape. Once he picks up the lantern, once he follows that thread, once he becomes aware, he can't put it down again. And there's a sense in which there's this binary at play. Either you humanize or you don't humanize. Either you see the humanity in the people who are suffering and being tortured, or you don't. If all your empathetic resources are dedicated or are applied towards the people that you're trying to protect, then there's no room left necessarily to feel empathy for these people, and then your moral compass is sort of shut off. Your humanization resource is not available, or it is available, and then you see the cruelty and the barbarity for what it is. And this this analogy, I think, is very poignant. Of can you hear the baby that wails underneath the window or not? How sensitive is your hearing? Do you have the courage to look in the granary, in the hut, to see what's going on in the hut by the granary or not? It's a big question. This is a scene where things start to go worse for our narrator. This is shortly before he's going to end up in a lot of trouble for trying to talk to the barbarians. he ends up, a woman is left behind from the initial roundup of barbarian men and women and children. She was tortured. She was blinded by the torturers. She sort of becomes our narrator's mistress to some extent. He's not the only one who sleeps with her. And eventually he wants to take her back and return her to the barbarians. And that ends up landing our narrator in prison for a while. But this is shortly before all that, where we have a confrontation between our narrator and I believe Colonel Jol, if I'm not mistaken. And he's sitting down across the table, and they have this sort of, I think, critical confrontation. The colonel says, I am more and more convinced. No, the colonel says, tell me, sir, in confidence, what are these barbarians dissatisfied about, right? Why we have a terror problem? Why are they attacking us? What do they want from us? I think this is our narrator, right? Our narrator says, what do they want from us? I ought to be cautious, but I am not. I ought to yawn, evade his question, end the evening. But I find myself rising to the bait. When will I learn to keep a cunning tongue? They want an end to the spread of settlements across their land. They want their land back, finally. They want to be free to move about with their flocks from pasture to pasture as they used to. It is not too late to put a stop to the lecture. Instead, I hear my voice rise in tone and abandon myself regretfully to the intoxication of anger. I will say nothing of the recent raids carried out on them quite without justification and followed by acts of wanton cruelty, since the security of the empire was at stake, or so I am told. It will take years to patch up the damage done in those few days, but let that pass. Let me rather tell you what I find disheartening as an administrator, even in times of peace, even when border relations are good. There is a time in the year, when the nomads visit us to trade. We'll go to any stall in the market during that time and see who gets short-weighted and cheated and shouted at and bullied. See who is forced to leave his womenfolk behind in the camp for fear they will be insulted by the soldiers. See who lies drunk in the gutter and see who kicks him where he lies. It is this contempt for the barbarians, contempt which is shown by the meanest ostler or peasant farmer, that I as magistrate have had to contend with for 20 years. How do you eradicate contempt? Especially when that contempt is founded on nothing more substantial than differences in table manners, variations in the structure of the eyelid. Shall I tell you what I sometimes wish? I wish that these barbarians would rise up and teach us a lesson, so that we would learn to respect them. Right? This is a crazy sentiment, right? I mean, this is not a very morally evolved thing to say. If you ask the Dalai Lama or you ask someone who's a moral voice, they would say, you shouldn't wish for violence. You shouldn't wish for revenge. It's a very base thing to wish for, but it's also very human, right? It's also very human. It's awful. It's human. It reminds me of the Americans rooting for the North Vietnamese to kill American soldiers. That was the same dynamic at play. We wish to see the barbarians rise up to teach us a lesson. We think of the country here as ours, part of our empire, our outpost, our settlement, our market center. But these people, these barbarians, don't think of it like that at all. We have been here more than 100 years. We have reclaimed land from the desert and built irrigation works and planted fields and built solid homes and put a wall around our town. But they still think of us as visitors, transients. There are old folks alive among them who remember their parents telling them about this oasis as it once was, a well-shaded place by the side of the lake with plenty of grazing even in winter. That is how they still talk about it, perhaps how they still see it, as though not one spadeful of earth had been turned or one brick laid on top of another. They do not doubt that one of these days we will pack our carts and depart to wherever it was we came from, that our buildings will become homes for mice and lizards, that their beasts will graze on these rich fields we have planted. You smile? Shall I tell you something? Anyway, this is a sort of ambiguous gesture he makes, the fact that, the water grows more salty every year. It's becoming less and less inhabitable on this outpost. At this very moment, they are saying to themselves, be patient. One of these days, their crops will start withering from the salt. They will not be able to feed themselves. They will have to go. This is what they're thinking, that they will outlast us. And of course, what emerges is that there is no way to really communicate across this divide. I mean, our narrator regrets not keeping quiet because there's nothing he can say. There's nothing he can say. He just ends up creating himself, identifying himself, outing himself as like an enemy. And he's also ends up being treated with the barbarous violence and cruelty of this anti-terror machine, this national security machine. In this context, thinking of national security, the war on terror, I think it is crucial to think about America's Iraq War. There are lessons from the Iraq War and Afghanistan War that I think we need to internalize. We need to internalize. Is because these incredibly expensive, brutal, deadly excursions, that who knows what they accomplished, probably nothing, just burning money, burning materials, wasting lives in these long, endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what is, we have an obligation, I think, to learn something, to try to investigate what that meant and what that was about. And, so a wonderful book in this regard is The Forever War by Dexter Filkins. I was trying to find out what year it was written in. 2008. Okay, 2008. Oops. All right, let's take a look at some of the lessons that we can learn, I think. Dexter Filkins talks about, again, America's war on terror in Iraq. And we're introduced to this character, Nathan Sassaman. In the fall of 2003, Nathan Sassaman, then 40, was the most impressive American field commander in Iraq. Okay? He was witty, bright, and relentless. The embodiment of the best that America could offer. That's so important to, use as context. We're talking about the all-American soldier hero. He was the son of a Methodist minister and a graduate of West Point. As the quarterback for Army's football team, he had led the school to its first bowl victory. When I met him, Sassaman was working day and night to make the American project in Iraq succeed, inspiring the 800 young men under his command to do the same. He slept in his boots, right? We're talking about the best America has to offer, the most courageous. He's describing sort of the scene in Iraq with Sassaman, his work policing Iraq, searching for out terrorists. There were ugly moments and there were hopeful ones. And they made me wonder not only what the Americans were doing to Iraq, but what Iraq was doing to the Americans, right? This is key. The struggle for the country was mirrored in the hearts of the men. Sassaman himself sometimes seemed like two people, the visionary American officer setting up a city council, and the warrior who took too much joy in the brutalities of his job. That's the duality, That's the duality, the corruption, the internal corruption that happens when people try to prosecute a long-term occupation of a hostile population that doesn't want you there. It's like Jekyll and Hyde out here, Sassaman told me after the Balad City Council meeting. By day, we are putting on a happy face. By night, we are hunting down and killing our enemies. So it describes that, Sassaman is leading his battalion on house-to-house searches. They'd been taking mortar fire from palm groves, and they're trying to figure out who's shooting mortars at them. It's, again, they're in Iraq. They're trying to find terrorists, and because they're there, they have to find more terrorists. Who's shooting at them in Iraq? That morning, the battalion's men swept into Abu Shakur, and without warning began to kick down doors. House after house, the soldiers poured in with their rifles, ready to shoot. They roused men from their beds and pulled them outside, many of them still in their pajamas and underwear, their wives and children looking on in horror. "Get down and don't move," one of the soldiers growled at an Iraqi man. In a raid on a particularly large house, the soldiers dashed inside, pulling mattresses off bed frames and clothing from closets, throwing lamps and cushions onto the floor. The soldiers pulled 11 Iraqi men outside, forcing them to sit on their haunches with their hands behind their heads. As they crashed through the house, a young woman stood with three small girls, probably her daughters, each with her hands high in the air. The Americans found no weapons. The Iraqi men squatted outside for half an hour, the unhappiness etched on their faces. I feel bad for these people, I really do, Sergeant Eric Brown said to me, standing over the Iraqi men. It's so hard to separate the good from the bad, right? That's the problem. That's the problem with military occupations. That's the problem with the war on terror. It's so hard to separate the good from the bad. By mid-morning, Sassaman's battalion had searched 70 homes in Abu Shakur and questioned dozens of men, but netted not a single gun nor a single suspect. If you multiplied the raid in Abu Shakur 1,000 times, it was not difficult to conclude that the war was being lost. However many Iraqis opposed them before the Americans came into the village, dozens and dozens more did by the time they left. The Americans were making enemies faster than they could kill them, right? And this is the consequence of a war on terror. This is the consequence of military occupation. This is what played out in Iraq. The story doesn't end there. There's a coda, there's a epilogue to the story, which I think is crucial. Again, in this military occupation, this policing project, there's a curfew. People have to be inside at a certain time. A group of Sassaman's men had been on patrol in Samarra when they spotted a couple of Iraqis driving around past curfew. The soldiers stopped the men, who happened to be cousins, searched their truck, and found a heap of bathroom fixtures. They told the Iraqis to hurry home. Then as the two men started to leave, the soldiers stopped them again. This time, the Americans cuffed the two Iraqis, whose names were Marwan and Zaydun Fadil, put them in the hull of their Bradley, and took them to a spot on the Tigris, which is a river, of course. It was a dark and frigid January night. The soldiers motioned with their guns. Jump, they told them. Marwan and Zaydun resisted, even begged. Finally, they went into the water, and the Americans drove away. It was a dumb call, Sassaman said, nursing his coffee. Pushing people into the Tigris at night, I now learned, was one of a number of punishments Sassaman's men had dreamed up to discipline the Iraqis, who had gone completely out of control. That is, discipline the Iraqis without killing them. They called it non-lethal force. Sassaman approved of some of the measures, disapproved of others. He claimed not to know about what his kids called getting people wet. Right? Non-lethal force, it wasn't hard to understand. By the fall of 2003, the Sunni heartland was in open revolt. It wasn't just that the insurgents were killing American soldiers. It was that the civilians were defying the Americans in every way they could, right? That's the outcome of this occupation project. That's the outcome of policing a hostile population. Whenever Sassaman soldiers entered a village, children threw rocks, adults threw rocks. People sometimes, entire villages defied the curfew. When the Americans drove onto the street, the locals would give them the middle finger. They would drag their finger across their necks. If I didn't do anything when a guy flipped me off, one of Sassaman's men told me in Colorado Springs, and the next time you drive around there, you're going to catch an RPG. We learn about Logan. Logan was the only American who acted with unquestioned honor. Logan, a low-ranking specialist from Indian Lake, Ohio, had been in the Bradley that night when his comrades spotted Marwan and Zaydun driving around after curfew. He'd helped cuff them, but when his lieutenant ordered him to throw Marwan and Zaydun into the Tigris, Logan refused, right? If I didn't make clear, one of them died. I think one survived, and I think the other one died. His body, he drowned in the river. Logan refused. Logan's commander was angry with him, but he let him stay behind in the road. The other soldiers walked Marwan and Zaydun down to the riverbank. I found Logan in the living room of his girlfriend's home. She was at work, and Logan was watching her two young children. The floor was covered in toys and papers and uneaten food. Logan was working day and night then, building houses and tending bar. Like Sassaman, he left the army too. Basically, the guys in the unit made it clear they didn't want me around anymore, Logan said. 2 years later, after I returned to the United States, I decided to track Logan down. I had some difficulty at first. It turned out he had left Colorado Springs and gone back to his boyhood home in Indian Lake. His grandmother was dying, and Logan wanted to spend the last weeks with her. On the night of September 10, 2006, Logan walked into the lobby of the Comfort Inn Motel and robbed the attendant at knife point. Then Logan drove to his mother's home. He left the $4,000 he got from the hotel in a bag in the car. He didn't try to flee. He didn't hide the money. 3 days later, a police officer came to the house, and Logan had gone to the same high school. He and Logan had gone to the same high school. Logan had been waiting for him. He confessed on the spot. He got 2 years in prison. His mother, Nancy, visits him twice a month. He's hoping to be a truck driver when he gets out. She told me she never heard about Marwan and Zaydun. I wonder every day if something happened to him while he was there, she said. Right? This is the cost. I mean, this is the legacy of wreckage. The legacy of disaster. Policing a hostile population. Creating enemies faster than you can kill them. It's awful. And the psychological toll on the soldiers. The way in which Iraq, it's not what America is doing to Iraq, it's what Iraq does to America. Our narrator in Waiting for the Barbarians ends up becoming very critical of empire. And this is an oft quoted line from the book, Empire dooms itself to live in history and plot against history. One thought alone preoccupies the submerged mind of empire. How not to end, how not to die, how to prolong its era. By day it pursues its enemies. It is cunning and ruthless. It sends its bloodhounds everywhere. By night it feeds on images of disaster, the sack of cities, the rape of populations, pyramids of bones, acres of desolation. A very powerful image from the end of the book. I think this is right at the end. There's just more restlessness. Colonel Joel sends out an expedition to fend off, find more barbarians, and they end up getting lost, and they come back haggard, and the Empire's soldiers flee the outpost, and the people who are left there are terrified, and this sort of image, which is sort of captured in the cover image of the book, is along the north rampart we have propped a row of helmets with spears upright beside them. Every half hour a child passes along the row, moving each helmet slightly. Thus do we hope to deceive the keen eye of the barbarians. Sort of a visual metaphor for that anxiety of empire that this book is so fascinated with. There's one section I want to just read in closing, which to me, again, really cuts to the moral core of the book. Really cuts to the heart of what this is about, and the heart of sort of what happened in this book, how this all unfolded. It's an incredible scene. 276. Late in the book, our narrator is getting interrogated because, again, this ongoing war on terror, this ongoing policing, this ongoing anxiety about the barbarians. We know from earlier in the book that our narrator, administrator, has found little relics of past barbarian civilization, past barbarian outposts, and he finds remnants of their writing system. He finds little pieces of paper where, not necessarily paper, scraps of wood, with writing on them. And he collects these. He's fascinated by them, and he's interested in this culture and this writing system, and he tries to decode them, but he can't. He can't decode them. There's so many different symbols, he doesn't know what they mean, but he has a collection of them. And in this process of securing the empire, Colonel Joel and others, they find our narrator's collection of notes, and so he's called in for questioning. Again, I stare into the black lenses, again, the sunglasses of Colonel Joel, that visual image, he goes on. A reasonable inference is that the wooden slips contain messages passed between yourself and other parties. We do not know when. It remains for you to explain what the messages say and who the other parties were, right? So at this point, our narrator has been sort of identified as no friend of the of the Empire's security establishment. He's seen as a threat. He's seen as an outsider, and as such, he's being called in for questioning. And he says, "You're clearly in cahoots with the barbarians, right? So please read to us. Please explain this script." So he takes a slip from the chest and flicks it across the polished surface of the desk towards me. I look at the lines of characters written by a stranger long since dead. Right? Of course, we know, as the narrator knows that these are not words or language that he can decipher, and these are certainly not messages he's been sending. I do not even know whether to read from right to left or from left to right. In the long evenings I spent poring over my collection, I isolated over 400 different characters in the script, perhaps as many as 450. I have no idea what they stand for. Does each stand for a single thing, a circle for the sun, a triangle for a woman, a wave for a lake, or does a circle merely stand for circle, a triangle for triangle, a wave for wave? Does each sign represent a different state of the tongue, the lips, the throat, the lungs, as they combine in the uttering of some multifarious, unimaginable, extinct barbarian language? Or are my 400 characters nothing but scribal embellishments of an underlying repertoire of 20 or 30 whose primitive forms I am too stupid to see? And so this is our narrator's answer to Colonel Joel sitting across the table. He sends a greeting to his daughter, I say. I hear with surprise the thick nasal voice that is now mine. My finger runs along the line of the characters from right to left, whom he says he has not seen for a long time. He hopes she is happy and thriving. He hopes the lambing season was good. He has a gift for her, he says, which he will keep till he sees her again. He sends his love. It is not easy to read a signature. It could be simply your father, or it could be something else, a name, right? And that is the moral core of the book. That's what this book is all about. It's just in this moment of pressure, in this moment of being forced to defend himself and make the case against the war on terror, right? Make the case against the oppression and the torture of these people. What's the case? The case is, it's a letter, it's greetings to his daughter. It's just they're human beings just like us. And when I think about this, I think in the context of like our social media, which is and news, which makes the world in many ways so close and so instantaneous and live, but at the same time, we aren't privy to just the human, the private, the non social media posting aspect of the humanity of the people that are so easy to dehumanize. It's a very powerful moment. Eventually, Colonel Joel realizes that he's being toyed with, and he's not amused. This is towards the end of his project here. He reads a few other notes where he describes him as a father, or a friend collecting a dead body from the Empire after it's been tortured. And this is sort of the end of this little experiment that our narrator is running with Colonel Joel. He says, "Now let us see what the next one says. See, there's only a single character. It is the barbarian character war. But it has other senses too. It could stand for vengeance, and if you turn it upside down like this, it can be made to read justice." Right? The relationship between vengeance and justice. There is no knowing which sense is intended. That is part of barbarian cunning.